Finland will become this Tuesday, the 31st member of NATO, the military alliance founded by the US with its allies to contain the advance of the former Soviet Union in Europe in 1949. 74 years later, it continues its expansion due to the threat from the successor state of the Communist Empire, Vladimir Putin's Russia. The Nordic country's entry is a strategic defeat for Putin, who invaded Ukraine in February last year, starting an earthquake in the world's security architecture. Central to the Kremlin's casus belli was to prevent Kiev from joining NATO by allowing hostile alliance forces to deploy along the Russian border. What we see is that President Putin went to war against Ukraine with the declared aim of having less NATO. He is gaining the opposite, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said before the start of the alliance meeting. Until now, Russia had a border of only 1,215 kilometers with 5 countries in the military bloc, or 6% of its total contact with the world by land. Now that more than doubles with the 1,340 Finnish-Russian km added to the bill. Russia reacted predictably with aggression. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said on Tuesday that accession increased the risk of the conflict expanding, and Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov said it is a further worsening of the situation, an attack on our security that obliges us to take countermeasures. In practice, there isn't much you can do other than repositioning troops and weapons, given that membership guarantees Finland access to Article 5 of the NATO Charter. If one member is attacked, everyone defends it. World War III, in other words. The Finns still maintained a security lock, approving access as long as nuclear weapons are not stationed on their territory. That said, the entry crowns a process of uniting an alliance seen as almost dead, moreover, an effect that the invasion had in the West, despite widening the divisions of Cold War 2.0, with China and Russia on the other side, in addition to countries that seek neutrality. The movement, however, highlighted important internal fractures in NATO. Turkey, which was the last country to approve the Finnish entry in parliament, is still vetoing Sweden's accession to the alliance, as is Hungary. A more powerful country militarily, the Nordic neighbor applied for entry along with Finland last July, but the Turks are resisting its entry by demanding that Stockholm hand over opponents of the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan that it shelters in exile. Compounding the crisis, the Swedish extreme right, whose party Fringe is part of the government, promotes periodic acts of open Islamophobia to provoke the Turks. Hungarians, as well as Turks with good relations with Putin, complain about Sweden's criticism of Viktor Orban's autocratic government. Both countries were the last to approve Finland's entry into their parliaments, a condition for accession, but the case of Budapest seems to have an easier solution. The one in Ankara, on the other hand, should be resolved over time, if Erdogan manages to secure his re-election in May and the delivery of more US F-16 fighters to replenish his fleet. But the impasse shows that not everything is the fraternal union painted in official speeches. Among the Nordics, however, there is an established consensus. So much so that, even without Sweden in NATO, Finland and the other 2 countries in the region that make up the club, Denmark and Norway, signed an unprecedented agreement unifying their air forces to better react to Russian threats. It is not impossible to replicate this among less militarily powerful members of the continent. That said, Finland adds to a border that has seen plenty of fighting against the Russians, most recently in 1940 and between 1941 and 1944, when Helsinki was allied with Nazi Germany, which ended with the Nordics losing about 10% of their territory and bequeathing a policy of neutrality that lasted throughout the Cold War and the years of the following Pax Americana. In the post-Cold War period, Helsinki was supported by a good relationship with the West, being in practice almost a member of NATO, and friendly ties with Moscow. Sweden's neutrality is even older, dating back 200 years, precisely due to clashes with the then Russian Empire of the Romanovs. All that changed in 2022. But it is necessary to limit the evaluation. In practice, Nordic neutrality was diluted when Sweden and Finland joined the EU, European Union, together in 1995. If a member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, the other member states must have an obligation to help and assistance by all means at its disposal, says Article 42.7 of the Treaty on European Union. Barring the unlikely expansion of the war, the Russians don't have many options. Last week, the country announced it would deploy missiles with tactical nuclear warheads, which are intended to be used against military forces rather than large areas, in neighboring Belarus. As perhaps they already have them in Kaliningrad, even closer to the Nordics, aggressive Poland and the fearful Baltic states, is more of a symbolic gesture, and, in this case, more aimed at trying to stem the escalation of Western military aid to Kiev, which could help the Ukrainians launch a counteroffensive in the coming weeks. That said, as locals and analysts alike have reported, the Nordic countries see themselves as more obvious targets now. It is a price for the change in the geopolitical landscape resulting from the European conflict and its insertion in the Cold War 2.0 between the USA and China, with increasingly defined sides. In purely military terms, Finland adds a small armed forces, with almost 20,000 people in uniform, but which, due to its mobilization rules, can be increased almost immediately. They are well equipped, however, and the geographical position is the jewel in their crown or a nightmare, depending on the point of view. But NATO was already the largest military alliance in history, with the US alone accounting for 40% of the world's defense spending, matched only by Russia when it comes to nuclear weapons. NATO's expansion to the east, denounced by him and by almost the entire Russian elite, is an inescapable fact. In 1999, the alliance began to absorb former communist countries, discounting the 1990 German reunification. In 2004, it made its big move by including 7 former communist countries, 3 of them former members of the Soviet Union, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Putin, already in power, felt betrayed by the failure to fulfill a promise never recorded on paper and even later denied by the last Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev, 1931 to 2022, that the former sphere of the empire would be untouched by NATO. Of the 8 expansions so far, 5 were to integrate 14 countries that were either Soviet, or under its military sphere, or communist, such as those that were part of the former Yugoslavia. In December 2021, with troops already surrounding Ukraine in alleged exercises, Putin issued an ultimatum about his strategic concerns. It was not heard, despite the fact that the Russian annexed Crimea and spurred civil war in eastern Ukraine in 2014 precisely because he did not want to see Kiev in the Western sphere. The rest is history.